Hello again. I was on the train to Brossoir on Friday, and I was scanning some news and came across quite an interesting ex post by Rupert Lowe, who is kind of focused a lot of his attention on this platform, and he in this post, which I've pasted into the description so you can look at it in the context of what I'm going to discuss here. He raises issues around the appointment of Mandelson, and he actually links the treatment of Mandelson to the treatment of Jess Staley. And as you'll be aware, this is something that we were focusing on many weeks prior to this. And I'm just going to go through some of the points that Lowe makes and try to put them into context and where I think there's been a oversimplification and so on. So if we start off with the post, really the first bit I draw your attention to is the paragraph under what the hell was Starmer playing at, which is it's a reasonable question, I suppose. And he talks about this Blairite, Brownite demolition of the UK Constitution. It's that bit that I'm really more interested in. The rest of it I'll leave for now. And the inspiration for this comes from David Starkey, essentially, who's very intelligent, really good historian. And he's focused a lot of his attention on what he calls a great restoration and repeal bill or something to that effect, where he's linked a lot of Britain's problems to Tony Blair's government, Blair and Brown, where essentially they created a lot of outer parliamentary entities, agencies, authorities, and so on, and shifted a huge amount of power and accountability outside of Parliament to agencies, authorities, quangos, and so on and so forth, which aren't subject to appropriate accountability and oversight. Now, I think this is a valid point. It is a bit simplistic to look at it universally, but it is a valid point. And I don't think Blair would have been blind to the fact that when doing this, he was opening up opportunities of a lifetime to his core profession, which is the legal profession, essentially. And actually, Starkey uses a term which I think is extremely relevant, and possibly he underestimates it. Is he uses the term, and I've used this in the videos as well because I really do agree with it. He uses the term, we are under the rule of lawyers, not the rule of law. And that is absolutely correct in my opinion. And a lot of the problems we face relate to that. And but moving on, I think to assume this great restoration bill where everything comes back, I think is a bit simplistic. You need to look at each entity in its own right, and that would take time because there's so many of them, and that's been done for a reason too. And I'll give you a couple of examples of where I think it's simplistic. So one they would say is effectively the interest rate setting powers passing to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England has been a disaster, and without accountability, and that needs to come back. That in itself is a bit of a simplistic one, because I think if you bring it back, you end up politicising interest rate setting, and you would get chancellors who would be slashing interest rates going into an election to create a feel-good factor, regardless of the merits of it in many ways. And so it's no silver bullet doing that. I think the issue is and I don't think the markets will see it, kindly either. I think having it done independently is fine and quite sensible, but that independent, in theory independent at least, entity has to be staffed by competent people, and that where I believe is the issue. I mean, if you look at Andrew Bailey, for instance, I'll talk about this in a moment. Catastrophic performance at the FCA, and then sort of, if anything, promoted above that, head of the Bank of England. So he effectively was promoted for a disaster. And look at his performance at the Bank of England. He in essence had to get Bernanke to come over and tutor him on how to model and read inflation, which is a huge embarrassment. And you look at his recent performance as well. Essentially it's cut interest rates when inflation is running at almost double his target, which is again extraordinary. And the other committee members as well, some are more meritocratic than others, the way it looks. And I think we've got a society now, and when you fill an application form in addition to your qualifications and the rest of it and your experience, it'll be what's your age, what's your gender, what's your sexual orientation, what's your religion, what was the social status of the head of your household when you grew up, what type of school did you go to when you grew up, and so on and so forth. And what this is social engineering. So you socially engineer organisations in a way that's fashionable, instead of basically getting rid of all that and saying, look, we'll accept applications from everyone, because why wouldn't you? Because you if you're looking for talent, you should be as wide as possible. And we'll just appoint the best people, not quota fill. And that is a lot of the problem. And if you look at the Labour cabinet, and from the start and through these resets, it looks like the product of social engineering, that same application process, which is why they are struggling. All the problems Britain faces are not theirs. They've been generations in the making. We've just got awful people trying to deal with them. And it's because of that process. So it isn't as simple as just saying pull everything back. Some entities you will look at and say, yeah, there's no reason for that to exist. They're making a mess and so on and so forth. But it isn't as simple as that. And I'll try and explain that as I go through more of what Lowe has put. And then he goes on to say, we are told in Parliament that the process followed with the appointment of Mandelson and so on was robustly defended, and so on and so forth. And then he's put evidently not, and then goes on to the treatment of Staley. Now, we knew that this was an issue. And to explain that, I'm going to go on to the next paragraph. So he talks about how Staley's not been done. So he's saying the FCA has done more damage to London as a financial regulator with a legal bias rather than the market bias, obsessed with avoidance of risk, not with the assumption of risk, which grows economies and creates wealth. Again, there are some issues here. One, the most relevant part he puts, in my opinion, a regulator with a legal bias. And this is what we spotted. And I'll try and, I don't think he fully understands this, but I'll try and put it in the experiences that we've had. It's throughout this video, I've told you that the main corrosive issue is having this regulator-prosecutor model. And, you've got situations where a regulator has clearly failed in its objective to protect consumers in certain instances, and then gone on to prosecute organisations or individuals where it holds that have fallen short of their regulatory requirements and so on. And, if you look at the Welltech situation, this is still to come to trial, so there are allegations. And John obviously has a right to defend himself. But as I've argued, the main issue here is where I couldn't reconcile and go to a point where I could help them in a legal process, certainly help them lots in intelligence, is you can't understand the allegations against John without understanding their own catastrophic failings. And it's massively corrosive and a conflict of interest when you've got somebody who's failed themselves being a prosecutor, because effectively they're going to try to structure it and control a narrative which shows that they haven't failed and try to allocate all the blame in other areas. And that's also the case with Woodford as well, because as I pointed out in other videos, is if you look at Woodford, as I said, I had some issues with the structure of the fund and whether they had the resources to do what they were doing. That was just my subjective opinion. I didn't ever form the impression that he was setting out to do any harm or wanted to harm his clients at all. That wasn't my concerns. So he faced a situation where now Neil Woodford's accused of failing to show due skill, care and diligence, and a defective understanding of his responsibilities as a person of influence in Woodford. And he's challenging that, so that there's still allegations gone to the upper chamber, and but you had a situation, albeit under different leadership then, we're looking at Bailey, not Ratty, where the FCA would have been fully appraised of what's happening in those final days, the suspension of the fund and then the decision linked to wind it up. And they stood off and they watched the situation develop where clients faced the worst case scenario, which is a fire sale of their assets. So in that situation, how can we say that they didn't, that they operated as a regulator with due skill, care and diligence, and they didn't have a defective understanding of their responsibilities to protect consumers? So you can see that the whole thing is unsustainable. And the legal bias here, why that's significant in my opinion, is because that is where your prejudice and so on comes in. This distortion and perversion of prejudice comes in to try to deal with that corrosive conflict of interest. It tries to be a filler that obfuscates it. And that is why, and it goes back to this rule of lawyers rather than the rule of law. And we could see this straight away with Welltech. And when they were communicating both publicly and to me personally, we were reading it, because when an organisation like that or any other similar, they put something out, you look at it and you think, what does it say? You look at it a few more times and say, what does it mean? And when you start analysing what it means, you almost become embroiled in the text. And you become temporarily the person who wrote that text. And it isn't always the same. Go back to your rule of lawyers, not rule of law. It isn't always the same person who puts a name to it, or the rump of it anyway. And you can see that as well. So essentially lawyers doing a lot of this. And we know who they are, and we monitor all that. This is why, when you do that process, it then sort of like illuminates, almost like a runway of where you need to go next to look. And that's why, we then started to look very closely at how they were trained, particularly from the investigators up to the senior staff, who was doing the training. So we're reading the training material and listening to it. And so we knew how they were going to communicate, and it was all matching up. And that is why when I wrote the book Lost to the Races, it was written very, really quickly. I had lots of other things to do. No one's going to publish that because no one's done it before. We don't live in a society that's free speech or free press. So, I did it really quickly off the top of my head. But, that's why effectively I've been able to show you, and through these videos, how exactly they would manage the case and how it would work. Because let's not forget that in the case of the FCA, they do this stuff and say it's limited by this and guarantee and whatnot, so it's a limited liability entity and blah, 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 blah. But really, strip it out for what it is. It's funded by consumers because, they sustain themselves by levying a fee on regulated entities, and that fee is paid, and that fee is paid out of the fees that, the regulated organisation charges clients. So effectively, clients fund the FCA. And, in the instances of Woodford and Welltech, you can see how, even though they're funded by clients, they try to obfuscate it a bit by the structure of the organisation. It's very clear that because of this conflict of interest, and with the help of this rule by lawyers, not rule by law, and this distortion of prejudice, a perversion of prejudice, which I've shown how Starmer uses it too, they're able to then operate this hierarchy. You get this hierarchy of greed where, the organisation that's being paid by the people they're charged with protecting ranks its own reputation and credibility above those people. And, that's at the front. Then you get your remuneration of legal professionals, and then whatever's left after it all, cobble together something, and the consumers, the victims, get something if they're lucky at the end. And that's why it happens. But then look at the FCA. So in terms of what he's saying here, and the Starkey influence, yes, the FCA have, in collaboration with lawyers, and when you look at these relationships very, very closely, have developed techniques to obfuscate even Parliament, because they do this prejudice. We can't come in and talk to you prejudice, and and I've done all that in the video, so I'm wasting time to go over that. But so there is an issue there, but at the same time, there's some convenience too, because if you look at Reeves's Leeds reforms, that they're a repackaging of Hunt's Edinburgh reforms with a bit added to it. As I've said, Reeves doesn't do ideas. She isn't capable. Her economic theory, if she has one, was a regurgitation of work from Janet Yellen. And we've seen how she's had brushes with plagiarism, CV embellishment, and there's other aspects in terms of the quality of journals that she's published work in, and so on. And as I wrote, the secondary objective is massively important, because essentially what they're doing is they know, they're trying to push growth through financial services sector, and with that means that it's expressed really with the secondary objective, and they know, because my issue here, and this is where I think Lowe gets it slightly wrong as well, because he's saying, that they're obsessed with avoidance of risk and so on and so forth. That's actually been changed, actually. It's been in change for a while, and it is part of the secondary objective, where the FCA are encouraged to encourage more risk taking and to address the issue that Lowe's doing. So he's behind the time here, and that means that essentially what's happened is both Hunt and Reeves are pushing for growth with a broken regulatory system. And the broken regulatory system is this conflict of interest that I've explained to you. So that it's very clear what they've said is, look, we'll protect you. We won't bring you into Parliament to be grilled on Woodford and WealthTech. So just do the work, just follow the secondary objective, help us out with this growth conundrum, and we'll carry you. And essentially that. So it's not as simple as saying that the FCA are running, their own agenda all the time. There is some of that, and I explained how that happens. But it's been a convenient relationship with both the previous and the current government as well. And if you look at it, when the Conservative MPs wrote to initially Reeves and then Shabana Mahmood when she was Justice Secretary, there was no Rishi Sunak, and yet there's WealthTech clients in North Yorkshire, and there was no Labour MPs as well. So you can see how the politics is bubbling up here. So you had two governments essentially that have said to the FCA that we need growth. They know very well it takes time to reform a regulator, and it desperately does need reforming to deal with that conflict of interest. You need to separate out those two. They're saying, that takes too much time. We need growth now. And they said to the regulator, look, we'll carry you. Just get on with this work. And that's where you are. And that's why I use this term, the victims of WealthTech have been sacrificed on the altar of the secondary objective. Because if you imagine, as I've said in other videos, if you brought back this into Parliament and said, look, we need a better explanation for Woodford, why did you stand off and let the worst case scenario happen? And WealthTech, as I said, some of the shortcomings would embarrass a frontier market. Why did you miss all these opportunities? Why didn't you follow up these basic lines of inquiry and so on and so forth? That would be very, very inconsistent with a narrative that's going out there trying to encourage investors to take more risk, to run down their cash and put more money into equities. So they'd look at that and think, well, hang on, I'm not going to do this because we've got all sorts of shortcomings in the regulatory architecture. So and this is why that's happened, and I think that's where Lowe has missed some points there. That's just my opinion. He's entitled to his opinion. But the issue with Staley is, and this is the problem with this rule of lawyers and these organisations that are able to, whether it's tactically or strategically, operate outside the parameters of Parliament, is you get this shadow system of justice. And this is really what we could spot with Staley, because we were reading this, because we knew some of the Epstein stuff that was coming down the line. There's obviously more to come that will affect other individuals as well. And you can see where we've now got a system where Staley has been banned and heavily fined for apparently understating the closeness of his relationship with Epstein. I think the point that Lowe misses here as well is what we found when we looked into this is it's impossible to see this without understanding the previous clash they had over the apparent desire of Staley to identify a whistleblower within his organisation, and they clashed over that. And it looked like he was being set up kind of with a catch-a question, and I think that possibly, I don't know for sure, you would have to ask him, maybe put him into a defensive mindset in how he answered the questions that were put to him over closeness, very subjective term of Epstein. And now we contrast that with Peter Mandelson, and if you go back and you remember, the interview that Peter Kyle gave, where he said, "Oh, we knew the closeness of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein, but we took a punt on his talent." Yeah, And then we've got a situation where, Starmer's sort of backing him and then saying, well, these emails that came to light where, Mandelson was expressing some injustice with the way that Epstein had been treated and how this should be challenged. Apparently Starmer didn't know about this, even though Mandelson was under some sort of investigation, albeit a hasty one, when he gave his answers in Prime Minister's Question Time. And that's, but you've seen one individual treated extremely harshly, losing his position, being banned and fined, and another one lost his position when it became too embarrassing for Starmer. But it hasn't been fined and is still carrying his title of Lord and is still, puts the relevant requests in as I make this video, able to go and sit in the House of Lords. And so you've got this shadow system of justice, and this shadow system of justice is a big problem, and it's massively, in my opinion, unsustainable how Staley has been treated, and we could see all this coming, and that's why when I made the videos, not where anyone else covered this at the time that we did, and when we were looking at this, it raised some eyebrows, and people said to me, well, I don't understand what you're doing here. And now I can see, hopefully you can see exactly why we did it. You can see what was coming down the line. I made some references and said people working with government and so on and so forth. So Mandelson, as ambassador to the US, extremely important role given the influence the US have in terms of the global economy, both financially and also the military side, has been treated very, very differently than the former CEO of Barclays, and that's a problem. That really is a major problem, and I think we are at a situation. This is why there's desperately a need to reform your FCAs and many other regulators like them, because you're getting these dual outcomes. It's inconsistent with, and this is the problem I had with them, is when I was dealing with them, and I said I need some assurances on these conflicts of interest, because you're putting out very misleading statements to the public. We could see how they were using this perverted form of prejudice to do it, to try to protect themselves. And I said, I can't be on board with a prosecutor that isn't being, firstly, you need to acknowledge the mistakes you made. You need to apologize for them. Try to put them right. And I need some assurances that this conflict of interest between you as in this case, a failed regulator, failed regulator with consumer protection oversight, and also acting as a prosecutor, and how key evidence is going to be administered and presented in this case. And then they just completely went ridiculous and started saying that they could use anything that I said or wrote in any form they want to without my consent. I said to them that that's just no way that's no way acceptable. I felt that I was being bounced into operating outside the parameters of the European Convention on Human Rights and all stuff like that. And I said, I'm going to need to raise these concerns with the with the court and also the other parties to the case, and say that I have these grave concerns. And then they came back and they said, you have to put everything through us. That's complete nonsense. If you've got concerns as a witness and you feel that you're under intimidation and threats and you're being manipulated, you've got quite an absolute right to raise concerns with the other side and the court themselves. So you can see that they almost, these organisations, they operate a shadow form of justice, and almost like a separate legal fiefdom. And we've and this is where, again, going back to your Starkey stuff, this influence in my opinion, Lowe. The other great falsity that they follow is if you get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights, everything will be all right again. That's nonsense, because there are many other countries that make that legislation work okay. It's the perversion of it by Britain's legal professionals that is the problem, because you don't see that to the extent you see it in Britain. In other countries that have it, they don't really have that much of a problem with it. It's a convenient one they put out there and said, if we get rid of this, everything will be okay. It's an oversimplification, and it's used in terms of the migrant crisis and things like that, and the immigration crisis. And again, I've covered this before, but they're saying that it's all from gangs and this, that, the other, and then it's perverted by the human rights legislation. The gangs push, the legal professionals and the private equity organisations that work with them pull. You need to address the both, and that's why you haven't seen the problem solved, because effectively now you've got a legal industry frontman as Prime Minister who made his money in this sector. So when he's under pressure, he'll do something, but nothing really will happen. As you can see, there's one in, one out thing. They're all gimmicks because he can't, because of who he's representing ultimately. And really, if people want their freedom back and so on and so forth, it is going back and looking at this Starkey observation that I totally agree with, is going back to being ruled by laws, not lawyers. By being ruled by a parliament who makes laws, not lawyers who run roughshod over them and interpret them in whatever way they want. And you won't get your freedom, speech, anything until that's solved. And you won't see your immigration thing solved either. It isn't the Human Rights Act, it's the lawyers. Go and look at other countries that use it, and you'll see. And the other con, incidentally, is they've interpreted freedom of speech champion as being Donald Trump and stuff. Trump is a con man. You will see this. He isn't freedom of speech, and I think you've seen that the last couple of days. Trump is no different than the people he was criticising. It's freedom of speech up to the point where it becomes criticism of him, and then it becomes vexatious, and you stamp on it and threaten, intimidate, and so on and so forth. Freedom of speech is everything, isn't it? If it's pro you, against you, you have to let it roll and just try to argue your case. But he's a con man, and it's the same as the market rallying and saying, "Oh, he's great, he's pro business," and things like that. He isn't. It's been seen before. It is mercantilist, crony, corrupt capitalism. It's been seen before. It'll look good in the short term, but it'll be a disaster in the long term. So the market's getting it wrong as well as people. Trump is a con man, and you will see that. And going back to, again, this shadow justice and this corruption by lawyers, it's the same as what we found in private assets. It's why I've mentioned private assets. You see the same in terms of the trading of vulnerable people from local authorities through courts to private equity-owned agencies. It's the same process where they're not subject to proper accountability. They're interpreting law in an extremely distorted way, and it's leading to these very, very poor outcomes where vulnerable people are just being traded like commodities. And it was a major issue with rape gangs too, and we know this. We've got all the receipts on this, from the local authorities to the barristers and the solicitors who work with them, to the court officials, to the private equity owned agencies. We know it all. We have the receipts, and we are going to name and shame these people. But it's the same issue. It's this shadow system of justice that's facilitated by this lack of accountability and this massive perversion of the legal system by lawyers. And to go back to the point, they say, well, prejudice is as a role and so on and so forth. To a point, yes. But if you follow it to the extreme example, the perverted example of Starmer and the FCA and all the examples we've seen with private assets, which we're going to come to, whether we do it now or right on the eve of 2027, some of that's out of my hands. But yeah, it's going to be done. The issue here is go back to this sophist Socratic stuff that I've used, and I've used it for a reason. If you follow the line of prejudice in this perverted form, you are saying by default that your legal system is corrupt, because you're saying that it isn't about the search of facts and virtue and right and wrong. It's about the ability to win an argument, whether you're right or wrong, by the perversion of facts and the presentation of those facts. You can't have it both ways. If you run with this prejudice thing, like we're seeing, Starmer, FCA, private assets, you are admitting your legal system is corrupt. You're admitting that you are operating in a rule of lawyers, not the rule of law, and the rule of justice. We can't have it both ways. And that is why I've used the terms that I have. Because if you step back with WealthTech, for instance, the regulator massively failed. Yeah, we know that, and we know how they've tried to cover themselves, and we know why Parliament have given them an easy ride because of secondary objective and so on. But they did fail, and they failed on Woodford too. But the fact that the regulator failed I'm using WealthTech situation here, wouldn't be a justification for misusing client assets, because it's illegal and it's wrong. And there's still allegations, and John has a right to defend himself. I know I've spoken to clients in terms of translating that to a percentage of the WealthTech client base. It would be quite small in percentage, but those that I have spoken to, believe that their assets were invested in a way that was presented to them via sheets of paper or a screen, and quite rightly so as well. I mean, that's not an unreasonable assumption to make. And really, I do hope both sides can recognise that, because they need to. Because John has a right to defend himself, and he can, and there's no, that must be recognised. But if client assets have been misused, the fact that the regulators failed isn't an excuse. It just means it's been made easier, potentially easier to do if it's proven. So the prejudice angle is nonsense. It always has been nonsense, and that's why I focused on it so much. And it's just not sustainable. So I hope this explains, the Lowe tweet, where I think he's got things right, where I think he's got things wrong, and how I was able to basically show you at a very early stage how these things will be managed and played out. What I might do is, if I find time, I've used this term shop window a few times, and I'll try and use an example using Starmer, because he's very, very easy to read and quite limited. And I'll show you how that's done, and I'll try to use his press conference with Trump to be able to do it, because it will help you in terms of understanding things. And I've tried to do that also in the perversion of the political spectrum, to try to give you some tools where you can cut through this nonsense. And as I always say, try to be the Socratic, not the sophist. Try to look at those inconsistencies, get down to the rights and wrongs, stand back, read the narrative, understand what it's really telling you, not what it wants you to believe, what it's really telling you, and you'll see things a lot clearer. So speak to you again soon. Bye.